Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the Immigration, Refugee, Asylum Task Team of the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ. My name is Carla Dietz, and I'm a minister ordained in the UCC and a participant in what we call IRAT. Now, IRAT fosters connections and empowers individuals and congregations taking faithful action to support immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. We're committed to listening to and walking alongside all our neighbors. And this afternoon, we're delighted to feature speaker Reverend Dr. Randy Mayer, Senior Minister of the Good Shepherd United Church in Sahuarita, Arizona. Did I say that right? Sahuarita? Great. You can ask your questions directly into the chat box while Randy is speaking, and we will collect them for our discussion later in the program. And we also invite you to let us know who you are and where you're from. You're doing that already. That's very exciting. And also to talk back and forth with one another is fine. The questions that you ask can only be received and answered by Randy because he's the only one who's live today. All the rest of the program is pre-recorded. So let's begin with an opening prayer. And it's by Lucio Perez, who is in sanctuary at First Church of Amherst, Massachusetts.
Primeramente, Dios les bendiga a cada uno de ustedes en esta maravillosa tarde. Estoy aquí en este momento, quizás un poco atrasado. Me pidieron que yo hiciera un video con una pequeña oración, pero estoy aquí quizás un poquito nervioso, pero voy a intentar y espero que todo salga bien cuando vean este video, esta oración. Sabemos que la oración tiene mucho poder. Yo sé que la oración es la llave para abrir la puerta de las peticiones que nosotros le pedimos a Dios, y espero que Dios los bendiga a cada uno de ustedes, a los pastores, a las pastoras, a los líderes, a cada uno de ustedes los que van a ver este video. Que Dios les bendiga grandemente por todo lo que están haciendo, por la comunidad. Yo sé que la pastora está siempre visitándome una vez por mes. Que Dios lo bendiga mucho, que Dios bendiga a su familia. Y espero que puedan entender este video. Está siendo grabado en español y ahora mismo pues voy a hacer una oración, y que sea Dios primeramente obrando en cada uno de nosotros. Amado Dios y Padre que estás en los cielos, santificado sea tu nombre, Señor. En esta maravillosa tarde, Señor, estoy aquí delante de tu presencia, bendito Padre Celestial, porque sé que solo tú eres bueno, solo tú eres maravilloso, Señor. ¿A quién iremos si no es a ti? Si sé que solo tú tienes palabras de vida eterna, bendito Dios, estoy aquí en este momento delante de tu presencia para pedirte, para suplicarte, Señor, que nos ayudes a cada día a seguir hacia adelante, bendito Dios. Muchas veces nos quedamos sin fuerzas, bendito Dios, como seres humanos, pero Padre amado, gracias porque tú nunca nos has dejado, tú nunca nos has desamparado, siempre has sido fiel con nosotros, a pesar de nuestras faltas, a pesar de nuestros errores, Señor. Tú siempre has permanecido fiel con nosotros. Esté con ella, bendito Dios. Guárdala de todo peligro, mi Dios. Guarda a todas esas familias que van a ver este video. Bendícelos grandemente. En el nombre poderoso de Jesús. Te doy gracias, mi Dios, hoy, mañana y siempre, bendito Dios, por los siglos de los siglos. Amén y amén. Que Dios les bendiga a cada uno de ustedes que van a ver este video. Quizás no va a ser fácil poder entender español, como a veces nosotros también no es fácil poder entender el inglés, pero que Dios nos ayude a entender cualquier idioma. Yo sé que a veces no es fácil, pero con Dios todo se puede. hay poder en el nombre de Jesús. Sé que sabemos que servimos a un Dios grande, a un Dios poderoso, a un Dios que nunca nos ha dejado, que nunca nos ha desamparado, y es por eso que nosotros confiamos en Él, porque aun cuando estamos en los tiempos más difíciles, Él siempre está con nosotros para animarnos, para fortalecernos, y gracias porque me pidieron este video. Quizás me atrasé en hacerlo, pero por muchas razones, pero espero que lo pueden ver a tiempo, y nuevamente que Dios les bendiga a cada uno, y hasta pronto.
Amen. And thank you. Coming up, you'll hear the stories of asylum seekers who escaped death due to their sexual orientation. These courageous individuals are from Jamaica and Uganda and arrived in Worcester, Massachusetts, where the LGBT Asylum Task Force, which is headed by Al Green at Hadwin Park Congregational Church, pastored by Reverend Judy Hanlon, has given them housing while they seek asylum. Due to the COVID-19 flight restrictions, one of the asylum seekers had to go to the Mexican border and cross just to be alive to tell you their story.
I left my country of birth because I was increasingly persecuted for my sexual orientation. I have been attacked, assaulted, locked up, lost a job, spat at, and called all sorts of names because of what I am. When my partner went missing, it became clear that living in Uganda was no longer possible. I feared for the worst. It was mid-March during COVID-19 pandemic that I borrowed some money and bought a ticket, packed and ready to head to Entebbe airport to leave. That night, I read news reports that all flights from the European Union to the United States had been suspended. Since I was desperate, I checked the internet till I found that Turkish Airlines was still flying to the US. And on checking, they had one seat available for that night. It was by God's grace that I was able to get onto this flight out of Uganda to America. It was a miracle because the next day, Uganda also closed its airspace to passenger air travel. While in Uganda, I had read about the task force at Hadwin Park Church in Worcester, Mass. So I flew to Boston and took a cab to Worcester and spent the night at Econo Lodge. The next morning, I arrived at the church just in time for worship on March 15th. I could not believe that the church was locked. I guess others didn't get the message either, because as I sat at the church entrance in the bitter cold, Cheryl and Bob also arrived for worship. I told them my story. They were kind enough and welcoming, and I felt safe. They directed me over to 8 Clover, where I found other LGBT persons from Uganda living there. I could not believe how God had brought me through.
My name is Robert. I am a gay man from Uganda. I was jailed and tortured. And I thought that I was going to be killed when I was still in Uganda. So I wanted to come to United States, but all the travel bans, all the travels were banned. So I flew from Uganda to Mexico. From Mexico there, I went to the Mexican border where everything of mine was robbed. I was beaten, and my money plus the passport and the cell phone were all stolen by the cartels on the borderline. So finally, I found some people who will try to help me to cross the river. I reached into there is a forest where I went. In that forest, I passed through. I made to the border. There are people called the border patrol agents. When I reached the border patrol agents, I told them that I'm seeking asylum in the United States. So to my surprise, they just take me to the detention. The first detention was so cold and there was a lot of light on it. That light was sharp. It could affect your eyes and the coldness was too much. You could be hungry the whole night. In those detentions, you could sleep on a small bed with 1-inch mattress. You could eat only like one bun, one bread. You could eat like one bread and you take water. I called my friend, one of my friend who was living here in Boston. When I called my friend in Boston, I told him that I want to be helped. I want to get out of this prison. So my friend told me that I can help you, but there is Pastor Jude Halton who can help you. So I called Pastor Judy. I told her that, have you got some solution for me to see that I can get out from here? She told me that she was on a Zoom call, with a lot of pastors from Worcester, Massachusetts, and told them that let me fast forward this man from a detention. He's a gay man, he wants to get out of the detention. So there was Reverend Natalie Webb from First Baptist Church in Worcester. That Reverend he first worked on the border of Mexico. So when he heard about that, she told Pastor Jude that there was a friend. He had a friend who was a lawyer at that Texas border. So that lawyer, he tried to find me. The lawyer is called Jennifer. He tried to find me in all those detentions. So he got me at the detention. That detention was called Ellie Valley Detention Facility. He found me there. So he told me that now we have to see that we get a credible fear so that I can get out of the detention. Because the credible fear, because of the due of homophobia, and there was a lot of COVID, and I could get hungry the whole night. Sickness was there too much. It was real horrible in that detention. So we are lucky God was on our side. So when we went to we saw the lawyer went to the judge, and the judge gave us a bond. But that bond was too much. The judge gave me the bond of $10,000. So we started to look for the bond companies all over the United States. But I was lucky that the bond company in Massachusetts had my situation and they paid my $10,000 bond. The First Baptist Church in Worcester paid my airfare. When I landed in Boston, I was picked up by Jude, who had referred me to the task force. He drove me to the hotel in Worcester, where I was quarantined for 14 days. That hotel was paid for me by the task force. So I reached there, it was around 2 a.m. in the night. I met the ministry director, who was called El Green. I was so happy that the time I saw El Green, he brought for me a telephone, which I'm using even right now, and a laptop. They paid for me for that hotel, and they gave me things to eat and some money from the task force. So I never knew in my life that there was a church which could believe that gay man is also created in the image of God.
Thank you to all who made their presentation videos. And now allow me to introduce our presentation speaker, Reverend Dr. Randy Mayer. Randy is deeply influenced by his time studying and living in Latin America. And his family moved to the borderlands 22 years ago so he could serve as senior minister of the Good Shepherd United Church of Christ in Sahuarita, Arizona, 35 miles from the US-Mexico border. Randy and his congregation have helped develop many of the humanitarian groups like Humane Borders, No Mas Muertes, and Green Valley Sahuarita Samaritans. And they give food, water, and medical care to migrants in the desert, for no one should be dying in our deserts. Randy has also guided the Good Shepherd in creating the Florida Food Bank, the Havarita Coffee House, a progressive theological lecture series, and Common Ground on the Border, a 3-day cultural event using arts to foster conversation around struggles of immigration and border life. Randy is a 1994 graduate of Andover Newton Theological School, and he received his doctorate in ministry from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in 2012. And just as a reminder before Randy speaks, Reverend Don Adams is happy to take your questions for Randy in the chat box as he's speaking. So Randy, welcome.
All right, well, it's great to be with you all. I was saying earlier that I do have a lot of connections to the Southern New England Conference. I went to school in Massachusetts. I served a church in Rhode Island, and I worked at Silver Lake Conference Center for a couple summers. So I am glad to be with you all. I'm gonna be showing a lot of slides, so I'm gonna go ahead and see if I can get into this. I think I just go there. Let's see if that works. Can everybody see that now?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, I just need to get to the slideshow and from the beginning, there we are.
Great.
Excellent. So what was very interesting, our title for this gathering is Angels Unaware, the Border is Everywhere. And I went down to the border a couple months ago to actually just film a little bit of a minute or two of the border wall and kind of introduce this topic so that they could use it to advertise. And I had filmed and I was back standing in the shade under a tree, and there out of nowhere, a migrant popped out of the bushes. And so we talked a little bit, and he actually wanted to be turned over to the Border Patrol. And within a minute, the Border Patrol was there. And so it's amazing how the stranger can come into our midst and change everything. It really startled me that day, but it sure has made me think a lot about this presentation that we're going to be talking about today. So this is the beautiful southern Arizona border lands. It's a beautiful area. And I moved here about 23 years ago, so I'm really very new to this area. My wife and I, we didn't really move here to be involved in the immigration issues, but it very much became a part of our lives because of within a year or so, the traffic of migrants really began to move right through our community. So we know that the United States has always been defined. We like to think of ourselves as a nation of immigrants, a country that claims to welcome all, using as its symbol that majestic Statue of Liberty and the celebrated poem that is printed on its base by Emma Lazarus that says, "Give me your tired, poor, huddled masses yearning to be free." But sadly, over the past 25 years or more, the United States has really desecrated those values and principles of the Statue of Liberty. If we go back, we begin to see that there's been chain link fences and walls of various types, at least in the populated areas, for quite a while. But the actual wall construction began in 1993, which was before the signing of the NAFTA free trade agreements. The NAFTA free trade agreements really changed everything along the border. The United States had trade ministers and trade representatives all over in Mexico and along the border doing interviews and presentations. They knew that there was going to be unprecedented immigration because the free trade agreements were free, but they were not necessarily fair. And once there were walls, that began to be built, then there needed to be more agents to guard the walls. Drones and helicopters to observe from the sky, the National Guard and military for reinforcement. And so now our borderlands is actually a militarized zone. It's just over 23,000 Border Patrol agents, and then another 25,000 ICE and support staff. So it's a massive law enforcement agency. This is actually downtown Nogales, Arizona. It's now, in the last couple of years, the Trump administration put 6 layers of serpentina wire. And so that is the welcome people receive when they arrive in the United States and most of the border towns along the US-Mexico border. This is way out in the middle of miles from population centers. And these are very recent pictures. The Trump administration has accelerated the building of walls over the last 6 months. There really was not much happening on the wall front until about 6 months ago. And now they're just trying to ram this wall in through all sorts of very difficult areas. You can see this is some of the wall construction close to us. It used to be impossible to get to these areas, but just incredibly beautiful scenic terrain, very pristine desert. But these walls are, in order to build the wall, they need to pump the aquifer, the water out of the aquifer to make the cement. And it's just really creating lots and lots of problems. Places we never thought there would be wall. There was no migrant traffic really in a lot of these areas, but the wall has been put up everywhere. This is the Sacred Saguaro. This particular saguaro probably took 75 to 100 years to get that big, and they're just mowing these majestic saguaros over. Most of the metal here you'll see is just, this was the previous wall. It was maybe 15 feet high, but they wanted the 30-foot high wall. Most of the migrants, if you talk to them, even this 30-foot wall really only slows them down a few minutes. But yet we're spending the wall that's being built now is costing between $25 to $30 million a mile. And so just very painful to see these scars that are created. This is actually the Quito Baquito Springs, a very, very sacred springs of the Tohono O'odham. This is out in Organ Pipe National Monument in the West Desert, west of Tucson, about 120 miles or so. This aquifer, this pond, this springs is now being, the aquifer is pumped dry. And so this very sacred place of the Tohono O'odham has really just been destroyed. Here's some of the saguaros being removed. Some of the Tohono O'odham have actually had protests. This is my friend Nellie Joe, who is sitting there in the bucket of that loader, and she's being arrested. She's a Tohono O'odham, saying that this is sacred land, being arrested there. They've had elders out there singing, doing, just trying to say this land is sacred. It shouldn't be, there should be no walls. And just very painful to see our brothers and sisters who have their tribal land is on both sides of the border. And so over the past 25 years, we've had 4 US presidents. A lot of people want to say President Trump, who has used hateful, derogatory language to demonize and dehumanize the migrants, that he is the pinnacle of this. He is the pinnacle of this, but you really can't get to President Trump without President Clinton. Well, President Trump has pushed cruel and barbaric policies that cage children. He's separated over 5,000 families. Many of the children have not been reunited with their parents. Babies that were actually torn from their mother's breasts, never to see their mother again. Just incredibly barbaric. Basically, we have criminalized poverty. But you can't get to President Trump without President Clinton. President Clinton put in place many of the anti-immigrant policies. He commenced the building of the wall, and he put more Border Patrol agents in the field. Clinton used the deadly Sonoran Desert as a deterrent, saying nobody would be that desperate to cross the desert. But you can't get to President Trump without President Bush either. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, his response was a retaliatory war in the Middle East and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security that accelerated the growth of the Border Patrol and militarized the borderlands. But you can't get to a President Trump without President Obama. President Obama, who came into office with great promise, but spent 8 years trying to win over conservatives with his tough on immigration policies. In the end, President Obama built more than 200 miles of border wall, deported more than 800,000 immigrants, tearing thousands of families apart, and grew the Border Patrol to over 23,000 agents. The point is, you can't get to the vile rhetoric of President Trump without Republican and Democratic presidents, the hateful building blocks put in place by President Clinton, Bush, and Obama. And so we as a nation have been on this security binge for over 25 years that has created the cruel and chaotic immigration policies and the out of control Border Patrol organization. Since 2003, the number of Border Patrol agents and interior enforcement agents has grown to over 50,000 and a budget of over $20.8 billion. That's 25,000% higher than the previous year. It's more than doubled its spending, and still the security hawks want more. So the Border Patrol acts with little oversight and accountability or transparency, extraordinary and unprecedented powers. And you all see that on the East Coast as much as we see it here along our southern border. In fact, within 100 miles of the coast and the southern border and the northern border, which is the majority of the population of the United States, is within that 100-mile radius of a border. And so we all are experiencing intense militarization. In fact, our Border Patrol along the southern border have killed over 70 people in the last 10 years along the border. And the Border Patrol has all of their investigations are internal investigations. So the community never really hears, and none of the Border Patrol agents that have killed somebody along the border have never gone to trial. One person has, and that was Lonnie Schwartz. So Trump's obsession on the border wall is purely political. And here we are in the midst of this election season. And last election, we heard all about this border wall, that it was going to, that Mexico was going to pay for it and it was going to resolve all of our immigration problems. The reality is that more and more people are here in the United States because they've successfully crossed and are now living in our communities, and they're really are building up our communities. They are the building blocks. They are the entrepreneurs. They are the people. All of our migrant and refugee friends are the ones that are the backbone of our communities. They're the ones that are the people, even during this COVID time, that were there working behind the scenes. So this is just pictures of our borderlands. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is that there is an intense resistance movement. There are people of faith, there's humanitarian groups, there are immigrant rights groups, there are groups right there in your communities along the East Coast that are there working to support and educate and do all they can to help make the journey a little bit easier once people arrive into our communities. Here along the southern border, we have our Green Valley Saguarita Samaritans, and we are really motivated because we believe that no one should die crossing the desert, and we need to take death out of the immigration equation. This is a map of just Arizona, and all of those red dots are where people have died. They are, and this is since 1999 through 2018, 3,339 identified or remains that have been recovered. We know that there are probably 2 to 3 times that have died in our deserts. And so the Samaritans, we go out in the desert and we put water out. We do searches, we call them searches, just to be a presence in the desert. Because when we're there, migrants will come to the side of the road and need help. We'll walk the washes. We know a lot of places where they lay up waiting for a ride. And so we give medical care, food, and water and support. We do not transport. So this is a typical search vehicle. We have a couple of search vehicles that are out even today. That was my phone that was letting me know what they're up to. And we do water drops. Really just a helping hand out in the desert. We have long believed that humanitarian aid is never a crime. And so even though the Border Patrol will come into our communities and say, you can't help people, you can't give food and water, it is actually our right as people of faith and of conscience to put out water and to give humanitarian aid. Many of you probably know of the sanctuary movement. It was a movement back in the 1980s when there were a lot of US-backed wars that were happening in Central America, in El Salvador and in Guatemala and Nicaragua and Honduras. They all were having the similar type wars, and the people, the union leaders and community organizers were being threatened by the military, and they would often have to escape, and they would come across the border of Guatemala into Mexico and then make their way up to the border. And there were religious leaders that would meet them in Nogales, Mexico, and then they would organize for them to cross the border, and they would come into the United States, and then churches would pass them along and move them up to Canada. what happened was that there were about 18 El Salvadorans that actually died out in the desert back in the 80s. And Sheriff Dubnik, the Pima County Sheriff, was very concerned. Why did the El Salvadoran government want to know? Why did the El Salvadoran consulate want to know why the names of those El Salvadorans? And so he began to investigate. And what was happening was, when they would find out the names, the military would go out and kill the family members. And so the sanctuary movement really was important in this area, and it saved thousands and thousands of lives. And it really raised the issue around what was happening in Latin America. That the United States was really supporting some pretty brutal dictators, and that the United States was in many ways protecting these multilateral, multinational corporations that were really doing pretty dirty business and kind of raping and pillaging the land, controlling the economy, and really working poor people at a rate that they couldn't even survive. And so in many ways, those are the reasons that we continue to have so many immigrants coming into the United States. It's because the United States, through our free trade agreements and some of our foreign policies, we literally have taken over economies and countries. And so in many ways, people are just following what was stolen from them. There's nothing there left for them to live for. The gangs that have now kind of taken over are really very dangerous and are demanding a quota from families to stay in their house for security. And if you can't pay it, they just literally kill somebody in the family. At any rate, back in the 1980s, the sanctuary workers began to develop what they understood as civil initiative. And civil initiative is the legal and the moral responsibility of society to protect victims of human rights violations when your government is the violator. In essence, individuals have international duties that transcend the national obligations of obedience imposed by the individual state. And so as people of faith, we have obligations to answer a higher call. Our faith ancestors knew all about the practice of radical hospitality, and we find it throughout Scripture. There's all sorts of stories of our faith ancestors opening the door and welcoming the stranger into their home. It starts back in Genesis 18, with Abraham welcoming 3 travelers, and Sarah and Abraham just dropping everything for these strangers. It was expected behavior to offer food, water, and medical care into your home and let them rest. And so in the Torah, there's the strongest impulses is to protect the stranger. That is why there are no less than 36 instances in Hebrew scripture of the Leviticus 19 passage that goes something like, the alien who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So there's really no wiggle room for us as people of faith to offer humanitarian aid, whether it's in the East Coast or the West Coast or in the desert. We are called to give of ourselves and to welcome the stranger into our homes. Jesus was a devout Jew, and so he followed those practices of radical hospitality. And we see throughout the Gospels then of Jesus practicing radical hospitality, of it's feeding the 5,000 up on the mountain, or just with one or two individuals. Jesus would go out to the ends of the earth to give compassion and hospitality. His practices of hospitality were always intense, personal, and countercultural. The Greek word that is traditionally translated in English by hospitality is philoxenia, which literally means the love of the stranger. And the early Christians were charged to offer hospitality. In fact, hospitality was the first marks of the Christian identity, and all other Christian virtues flows out of this one practice, hospitality, to love the stranger. So if we read scripture seriously, we begin to see that the Bible is this immigration handbook. It is a guide for us to be people of hospitality, to go out to the margins. If you want to call yourself Christian, if you want to call yourself a follower of Jesus and his ways, you must become skilled and seasoned hosts. And that is how we as Samaritans really got into the business of hospitality, of loving the stranger in the desert. We did it by reading the Bible and following its instructions. So we noticed that Jesus didn't just stay close to home. He didn't just stay in the temple. Jesus went out and found the people in need. He went out to the Jordan River and beyond. He went out to the well. He went to the margins to find people that were in need, and he offered them hospitality. And that's how we really started our Samaritan group. We were out there looking for people. There were people that were dying in our neighborhoods. And if people are dying in your neighborhood, you have to do something to begin to figure out what's causing this. Why are people dying? And so we would go out to put out water. When we were putting out water, we were finding lots and lots of migrants. And so we really took our name from this Good Samaritan in scriptures. And we know that story. The Samaritans literally replicated the words and work and words of their namesake in scripture, who took a risk, broke the cultural norms to give life-saving support to his neighbor on the treacherous road to Jericho. I'm sure our community is no different than the community you live in. We have an abundance of priest and Levite types, pious and holy, overly concerned about themselves and their standing in the community that prevents them from taking a risk, from getting their hands dirty and helping the refugees, the migrants, the people that are arriving at our doors. They would rather keep the purity laws than save lives. At the Good Shepherd, we actually had a protester in front of our church for about 2.5 years. He would always have his sign, which we always rather enjoyed. It was a little bit contradictory. It said, "Good Samaritans, bad Americans." Try and figure that one out. Amazingly, my congregation loved this guy. They would go out and talk with him. They would bring him coffee. I wanted to put him on the payroll because he brought so many people to the church. Our Samaritan group is really just a ragtag group of people in our community. Many of them are from the church, but it's so much bigger movement than the church. It's people of faith, people of conscience, people from lots of other churches that come to support. And that's what I think this movement is really about is just harnessing compassion and finding ways to accompany our brothers and sisters as they are finding their way to life and finding their way in our community. And so a lot of people like to go to Matthew 25 that says, it says, "When I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me water. When I was a stranger, you invited me in." We all get that one. When we care for the least of these, we care for Jesus himself. But I like this passage from Hebrews 13 a little bit better that says, be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. It has a little bit of mystery and love of the stranger to it. Representative Juan Vargas, who represents the counties south of San Diego in the U.S. Congress, he actually studied to be a Jesuit priest. I was in Washington, D.C. once doing some lobbying, and I ended up in his office. And Juan Vargas's first question to people that visit his office in Washington, D.C. is, what is your favorite immigration passage in the Bible? Can you imagine what our Congress and our world would be like if more politicians would ask that question? That was the first question they asked when they made a speech. My first meeting with him, when he hit me with that question, my response was Hebrews 13. Don't forget to entertain strangers, for some have entertained angels unaware. I told him about some of the angels that we have met in the desert, and his eyes teared up. If you live in the borderlands, you have seen plenty of angels. I love this passage because it has hints of the hospitality story of Abraham and the three strangers, has hints of Matthew 25, seeing Jesus in the face of the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger. To be honest, I didn't believe in angels when I first moved to Arizona, but I do now because I've seen them with my own two eyes, their soft wings, the breeze that blows with them and through them like a feather in the wind. Sometimes the angel is the stranger in the form of the migrant. Their strength, their pure commitment to the family and loved ones, willing to risk it all for life and love. We need more people like that. Not just a community, but a world filled with deeply committed, loving people devoted to faith and to family. I will risk everything to help them find their way. But sometimes it's amazing. The angel is in the form of a Samaritan volunteer, a humanitarian worker, a lover of the stranger, being present in the right time, in the right place, providing basic needs in hazardous circumstances. But more than that, it is the meeting of the stranger and treating them like a long lost friend, like a child of God, made in the image of God, like they matter. And you will go to the ends of the earth to make sure that their needs are taken care of, that they are treated well. Jesus had this amazing way of being guest and host in the same encounter, somehow flipping the roles. And I see that happening all the time in our deserts. Our Samaritans go out to literally save lives in the desert, but more often than not, they come back and their lives are the ones that are saved and transformed, never to be the same again. If you have a heart, how could you ever be the same? And sometimes the migrant, in their place of such fear and need, receivers of emergency care, just by their presence, unable to give anything, are overwhelmed by the love and care they receive. They had feared the worst. They had heard so many stories of these angry Americans out in the desert, the hatred they'd seen on TV. And that is what they were expecting to receive. And instead, they were embraced and blessed with compassion. In the desert, on the margins, everything gets mixed up, gets turned upside down. Who is the stranger? Who really is the angel? Who is saving who? And does it really matter? The only thing I know is that it is holy and it's sacred. It's filled with mercy and grace. And I know it's happening here along our US-Mexico border, but I hear stories all the time of churches and individuals and people of faith that are doing amazing things in your community as well. So what we say is we're going to continue being resistance. We're going to continue to be people that are going out to the margins and see what God is going to offer. And we'll be there to help anybody. One of the areas that we've really focused on lately, especially as our US-Mexico border is now closed for legal traffic. There's a lot of people going around the walls and climbing the walls, trying to come here. But there are shelters now in Mexico, and we have opened a number of them. One of them is called Cruzando Fronteras, La Casa de Todas las Naciones, and it's an ecumenical project of the United Church of Christ, the Episcopal Church, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. We have a facility in Nogales, and we presently have about 250, 260 people living on the property. It's secure. There are no COVID cases there. And we have a beautiful garden. The migrants really, since it is a program to support asylum seekers, they're pretty much running the program. They're cooking, they take turns cooking, they take turns preparing the menu. They've been doing a lot of the upkeep of the facilities. They're doing some electrical work here. Amazing skills that they bring. Here, a bunch of the men are getting food ready. The Mexican government is actually sending in teachers to teach the children. There are probably, I think, about 75 or more children. Here are some of the families. And here are a bunch more. They will eventually, we're hoping that eventually the border will be opened and they'll be able to continue their journey as they seek asylum. We believe no one should die trying to feed their family. And so we'll continue to leave thousands of gallons of water. We'll continue to be a life-saving presence in the desert. We'll continue to work with deported migrants. We'll continue to educate and advocate. And we'll continue to work as a faith community and beyond. Don't build a wall, build a larger table. We have so much abundance. Why can we not share? This final picture is a picture of a UCC gathering that we had about a year and a half ago, just bringing people to see the crisis at our border and so that they could go back into their communities and begin to find immigrant communities and find ways to accompany them. And some of your folks there in Connecticut and Massachusetts were out here for this event, and they went back and are now the angels unaware in your community. So the border really is everywhere now. I think that is the rest of my presentation. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Randy. If you could hang in there with us for just a little bit before we go to questions. Here's a first-person video created by Reverend Liza Neal of the Trans Asylum Seekers Ministry Alliance. It's a ministry of faith communities in the UCC and interfaith partners dedicated to refuge support and community of and with trans asylum seekers. They provide emotional and financial support, medical and legal advocacy, housing and community for trans asylum seekers who face significant persecution, not only from their countries of origin, but often from their own families. Trans asylum seekers are subject to intense persecution with detention centers, not only by the guards, but with the other people that they are detained with. And this is part of the story of one of their compañeras.
Hi, my name is Madison. I'm a trans woman. I'm from Honduras. And it was really hard to leave from our country. The situation in Honduras is difficult, a little difficult for us. Some of us decided to leave from our country because they didn't support us, as well as the bullying, the disrespect from our family for being who we are. Some of us were raped. Some of us were killed. In the community where I lived, I mean, people, they just don't accept sort of people who are different. They just saw me as sort of a strange kid. I left from my country on April 2nd, 2019. I was in Mexico for 11 months. In Mexico, the situation was really difficult for me. I worked and I was discriminated against, as well as others from my country who were as well. I had problems with people who didn't accept me for who I was. And so I decided to come to this country. In detention, it was horrible. I was 4 months in detention center. I was in different detention centers. I started in El Paso, Texas. I was there for a month and a half. The third detention I was in Dorado. And that was where I was with other women, and I was bullied for my physical appearance. The doctors visit us once a week to give us some medication for all the stress, for headaches, but they're very strict rules. They let us out for a half an hour to go outside. I left detention on June 4th, and then the next day I came to Massachusetts. It's a huge help to be here in this country, to be able to be yourself, to feel free. The support I get is really good. The churches support us. You know, sponsors help us as well. They help us with respect to clothing and food, a home. And you get to know new people. I feel free. No one tells me how to dress. I can wear makeup and I'm not discriminated against. My dream is to better myself, to be happy, to live far from my family, just the way I am now. I don't miss my family. I want a house, a home, and to be happy. I have plans to change my birth name to my feminine name, to be a new person. I like who I am right now. For people who are feeling depressed for being who they are and not accepted by their friends and their family, or being discriminated against, I just hope that they will keep going, that life doesn't end, even though it can be really hard. We keep going. I think that my life is always going to be a mystery, but I take it day by day. Will all flow from my interior Madison, is who I am. It's a pleasure to have this talk with you. Thank you for listening to me, and hugs and kisses. I love you. Bye.
Thank you. That was very moving. And Randy, thank you for all the information that you imparted and the wonderful ministry that you do. We appreciate that all the participants today have thoughts and questions, and they've been collected by Reverend Don Adams and Cindy Worthington Barry, both of who did all our technical today. So we just want to thank them for that. It was really good of them to do that. So let's go to question and answers. Dawn, would you like to lead us off?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Carla. Hi, Randy. We are so appreciative of you being here today.
Yeah.
One of the questions that came up that I just want to answer for the people that are listening, we have recorded today, and we appreciate those of you who have asked about sharing this with your congregation. We, in fact, encourage you to. So please be in touch with us later to receive that and figure out how best we can bring this information to your congregation. So Randy, we have people on this call that have many different levels of understanding and involvement in immigration issues. Some have been involved for years, and others are just leaning in with curiosity, trying to understand the nuances of very complicated issues.
Yeah.
So let's start personal. I was actually listening to the minister at the UCC church in Fort Worth, who said that facts are unlikely to change anyone's mind. It's really our personal stories that change people. So we've heard a lot of stories from immigrants. What is your story? How did you become involved with immigration issues, and how have you stayed so committed to this cause?
You know, my story is really a UCC story. I grew up in the UCC in Montana, and I went to a national youth event in a long time ago. It was probably in 1985 or so, and my whole world was opened up. And I quit college and I went to work at a children's home in Indiana. But then I kept going after I went back to college, but I ended up volunteering for a year in Costa Rica. And that year in Costa Rica, really, I learned Spanish. I got to know liberation theology. I was going to a bunch of different churches. And so really my whole life changed because of that experience. And so my wife is from El Salvador, and so I ended up spending a lot of time in El Salvador and with the Lutheran church there and the Baptist church. Was during the war. Just really fell in love with the people is what it was, and their struggles and the way they continued to persevere. And even though the world and the United States had a lot of our policies have done incredible damage. And so I eventually went to seminary for a year in Costa Rica. And at that time, I realized, my ministry, as much as I wanted to be a missionary in Latin America, they didn't need another gringo in Latin America. They needed, people in the United States that were helping their story, tell their story, the real story of what was happening in Latin America, but also to practice almost a reverse liberation of, helping people that were coming into the United States to welcome them, but also to help develop. In a lot of my mission in the United Church of Christ is, how do we continue to expose people to the border and help them understand the issues so that they can go back and then practice that and find immigration communities where they can just be help accompany people. So that really is my journey, and I'm still here. It's my passion.
Thank you for sharing that. So one of the other questions that came up is that we all know that the topic of immigration brings out strong emotions, which are even more elevated during an election time. So how have you and your church and the groups that you are involved with dealt with any of the controversy or pushback around the immigration work that you do?
Yeah, well, a lot of what we do, and Arizona is kind of ground zero in many ways. And yet there is, along the border, there's pretty much agreement of that the wall hasn't done any good. And when you have 30 environmental acts that have been waived to build the wall, you begin to see that our community has been torn apart. And what should be an economic engine for our community and the country, 1 out of every 25 jobs is connected to this US-Mexico border. It's not working efficiently. You can't tell me that the Border Patrol and Homeland Security, if they were any other corporation, they would have failed. They failed. There's over the last, even in these times of Trump, our immigration numbers have doubled in the United States. And so what we really need is common sense answers or policies. There's no reason why our immigration policies have been like a magnet pulling people into this country, but immigration used to be circular, and people would come and work for 6 months and then they'd return, and they built vibrant communities as best they could. That's what we really need, is that people can come, work, and return. And we don't want just the United States to be great. We really want Mexico and El Salvador and Guatemala to be great, because when they thrive, we all thrive. That's what we should really be working for. So along the border, people, I live in a very conservative community, but I have no problem saying, this administration has really torn our community apart and destroyed the environment. And so if you love this community, and then we have to be working for better changes, because what's happening now isn't working. And the people we love have been torn apart, and their families have been torn apart. Our schools are a mess because of this. Our healthcare is a mess. We have to work together on this. And so it's somewhat controversial, but it's also, how do we work together to resolve these? Because immigrants are really the answer to our future as a country. They bring the energy, they bring the new ideas, they bring their food and their culture. And when we appreciate that, it begins to cheer us along as a white person or as an Anglo culture. It brings something. And so I always say, we all need an immigrant as a friend to just give us good perspective. Just as we need a Muslim and a Jew, we need to be walking with the homeless. That's what the journey of faith is about.
I agree with you. I'm going to jump in here, Dawn, but you must get a lot of pushback on that in your conservative community.
Well, there's definitely people that push back, but my congregation has really become a magnet for people that want to be working and really want to focus on the parts of Scripture that talk about hospitality and love rather than exclusion and all of that. So there's pushback, but surprisingly we don't get it. I used to get a lot of pushback in my community because they used to say, oh, the Good Shepherd, all it cares about is illegals and people from other countries. And so we started the food bank. And the food bank now feeds 3,000 or 4,000 people a week. And now they're all upset because we're helping people that in these COVID times that barely can make ends meet. You're going to get pushback, but we just continue to expand our mission.
Thank you.
And so, Randy, I have about 6 more minutes and about 6 more questions. So we're going to try to move through these. And I was really appreciative of one of the things that you mentioned in there, which is both in your program and in your comment, that the nexus between immigration and climate are things that go together.
Yeah.
So often we look at immigration as an independent issue. And I'm wondering, in your experience and your work, what other segments of the world is there intersectionality with that you can think of that people might not think of off the top of your head?
Well, the economy is a huge one. The environment, you know, there's places in Central America that are just unable to, people can't grow anything anymore. You know, I think the farmers in Iowa and places like that, they understand what's happened in Mexico. They, you know, the people, because it's happened to them too, you know. But the United States continues to have subsidies for the farmers. The other issue that has been really interesting for us is, you know, we've had a lot of folks from Italy that have come over to learn about our immigration and our humanitarian work, because it's happening in Europe as well. And so what you begin to see is what the United States colonized, and the other countries did too in Latin America, but European countries colonized Africa and the Middle East. And all those countries, because of the things that were done, are the places where immigrants are coming from, because they can't survive in an economy that still has siphons all the money to another place.
So this folds into a question that Kate asked. The name of our topic was "A Border is Everywhere." And I was wondering if you could speak a little more to this. I know this is a little outside, and we'll hear a little more from this later from Noel. And she specifically says, so she asked, how do we help in a time of COVID when we can't go there? And I thought that actually underlined the border is everywhere. How can you speak to that?
Well, let me say a couple things first. Is that because we have been militarized along the US-Mexico border, along the coast, there's a group called the BORTAC, which is a special security team. That security team has been sent to Portland, to Chicago. It's kind of a militarized organization within the Border Patrol that it, you know, uses violence. They're just brutal. What's interesting is that the United States no longer sees our southern border or our coast as our border. The border is actually in Guatemala and Mexico. It's further into Latin America. Our border, BORTAC has gone and trained countries, over 100 security groups in over 100 countries. So our border, the United States border, is trying to stop immigration from ever reaching our shores. And so we've infiltrated all over the world. So that's one answer to the question. The other, you know, everybody now has immigrants in their community. That's what our immigration policies have done, is that there used to not be a Hispanic grocery store in most cities or most little towns in South Carolina or Massachusetts, but now there is, because of our immigration policies. And so we have no excuse to say that people need to come to our border. The border is now in every community. If you go to South Dakota, there's a huge immigration. In Iowa, there's a huge meat cutting plants. Everywhere in Georgia, there's massive amounts of immigrants. So the border is now everywhere. But if people want to send, we need all sorts of support with our programs, supporting asylum seekers that are stuck at the border, running a shelter for close to 300 people. All of our work takes a lot to get clothes, to get food, all of that. So people have support they want to send. Anything. We'll take money, we'll take clothes, we'll take whatever people send.
So I'm crunched by time here,
Yeah.
and I'm going to ask you a question. Do you have a few minutes afterwards if we run over for those? We
Yeah.
have like 3 more questions. So what
Yeah.
I'm going to do is turn it back to Carla right now, and she's going to move on and offer Noel and some music. But when we conclude, if people have extra time and want to stay for the 3 more questions that we have, that would be greatly appreciated, Randy, because we have some really important questions to touch on.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Randy. Reverend Noel Anderson is a good friend to IRAT and to Randy. They know each other well, and he regularly contributes his time and considerable knowledge to us. He's the National Grassroots Coordinator for Church World Service, where he has developed a national network of faith communities taking action in solidarity with immigrants and refugees. And he's ordained in the UCC and is the lead organizer and co-founder of the National Collaborative on Immigration, a grassroots network of UCC leaders. He's also instrumental in creating a refugee leadership development for social change project at Church World Service, helping train hundreds of refugees in community organizing. And he videotaped this message for us today.
Hello, my name is Reverend Noel Anderson. I work with the UCC National Collaborative on Immigration, which is a network of grassroots pastors throughout the country passionate about this issue of immigration. I also work with Church World Service and our immigration refugee program, and I'm honored to be invited to speak with you all about what's happening on immigration and what we're doing as the UCC. So thank you for organizing this. Thank you for all the great work that you are doing in the Southern New England Conference. And I'm going to switch over and share my screen here. Great. So there is, of course, as you all know, always a lot going on around immigration issues. And the border really is everywhere. It's in your community, and there's a lot you could do. We are all called by faith in this work, and that's what motivates most of us. Also, we see that in our community, we know the impacted members. They're our neighbors, and we're called to love our neighbors and welcome those in our midst. And in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen just a constant attack by the Trump administration on immigrants, also the legal immigration programs such as Asylum and the Refugee program. We've seen the Muslim ban. We've seen huge raids that are deporting more and more people. We have seen the criminal prosecution of people, which has caused separations at our border. We've seen the border wall going up and taking funding from other programs to make that happen. The citizenship question on the census trying to lower the number of immigrants who participate in that, and then weaponizing of COVID-19 against the asylum program, against people applying for green cards or citizenship by furloughing USCIS employees, and now more and more COVID-19 positive cases in the detention centers. Here we see the Native Americans actually protesting the border wall as the border wall goes into very environmentally sensitive regions and on sovereign land. And many people are responding and pushing back. And in the detention centers, COVID is spreading, and that can be dangerous to those who have health risks, can spread more to more people. And so we're calling for the Free Them All campaign, that everybody in detention and incarceration should be released, and so that they're not at risk anymore. We've seen the numbers go up a huge amount in detention, from 34,000 to 51,000. We've seen more and more people deported, 40,000 people. And with COVID-19 positive cases, there's been hundreds of those, to now 11 different countries that are reporting this. And this is, again, spreading COVID-19 farther. We've seen unwanted hysterectomies in detention centers of detained women. And these horrific things in Georgia and Urin and Stewart detention centers are something that we think could be in other places, and it's still hidden. And so we're asking members of Congress to hold people accountable And here is a picture of Don Wooten, the whistleblower and the activist protesting those detention centers. As the UCC, we've done a lot in response. We've had a lot of resolutions supporting immigration reform. We've become an immigrant welcoming denomination. And we have gone out and been at ICE offices and actions and at the border. And here we are in the front of the Baltimore ICE office in General Setted 2017. Here we are at the ICE Milwaukee office. Oh, they actually suspended Senate for us, and more than 1,000 people came to that. We've brought 22 conference ministers to DC to do actions and meet with our representatives. This was our plan in the National Collaborative on Immigration. And now we're succeeding in this. We're getting more and more immigrant welcoming congregations, sanctuary congregations, conference task force like yourselves involved. We've been to the border. That's President Dorhauer leading a vigil, Reverend Tacey Blackman marching at the San Diego border, and also in DC, giving testimony about why we should stop family separation at the border. What does it mean to be a sanctuary congregation? It means that you're in solidarity with the undocumented community, and you're participating in all these activities, advocacy, stopping deportations, assisting in legal clinics. And then not everyone is doing this part, but if you feel called to, offering the physical shelter to an immigrant in danger of immediate deportation. This has been a growing movement, ecumenical interfaith, from 400 to 1,200 congregations now, and the UCC has been a big chunk of those congregations. But we also have in the UCC the immigrant welcoming model, which is really a way to engage those in what does it mean to actually welcome people no matter where they are on life's journey, no matter what country or of origin, no matter their documentation status, and really being engaged in the same way we do any justice work, educating our congregation, being in relationship with impacted community, dialogue and conversation with the community and immigrants' rights groups, immersion experiences, and when we feel called to, doing that covenant for immigrant welcoming congregation, or becoming a sanctuary congregation, or taking a congregational vote, making the public statements, continuing that advocacy, that action, that community organizing work. We know there's going to be a huge difference between the candidates on this issue. So we're really encouraging people to get out to vote, of course, as part of our faith, our vote. And we have more action steps that we can send you in follow-up, and more resources from some really key organizations. Very glad that you all invited me to be part of this, and we will definitely be in touch. God bless, and keep up the great work.
Hi, Randy. We're going to jump back in together to ask and talk about the questions that we haven't gotten to. I have let our attendees know that if they have to hop off, they will. And we're going to hold our official closing till after we answer a couple more questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
So this week we have seen 172 immigrants were arrested in 6 different sanctuary cities. This step is said to focus on those with criminal records. Can you speak to your concerns in these actions and this philosophy? And I'm going to tie this in with a question that came from one of our guests, which was, why doesn't ICE focus exclusively on the undocumented with major criminal records and leave alone those who are law-abiding and contributing to the community and economy? The person is frustrated that so many are targeted for no reason other than they are here illegally when others have criminal records. And they ask, what can we do to redirect ICE's efforts? So some education on that would be very much appreciated.
Yeah. Well, most of my work is here along the border. My experience with ICE and Border Patrol is that, especially with this administration, is they are just trying to put fear into immigrant communities. And so, and a lot of this is completely, is kind of unfathomable, and yet it's happening. There are raids in particular communities that, some of it might be, I think it's political. It's to raise the issue of immigration in those communities. and try and produce a particular vote. It's that crass. I mean, that's literally what's happening. And you know, it's criminal, but it's happening. And so I don't know if there's any better explanation, but it's pretty depressing. And yeah, it's tearing apart families, and you would expect, Obama would, under his administration, although he tore, hundreds, thousands and thousands of families apart, his approach was a little bit more, if you weren't a high risk, if you didn't have any prior convictions, they would not be deporting you. You were not on the high list to deport. But this administration almost wants to go a step beyond to actually go after, older people, mothers. It really does not matter with this administration. I mean, when you literally hear that Homeland Security directors were and our Department of Justice was really literally saying we want to separate families. That is our intent. We want it to be cruel, is what they said.
Right, cruel as a deterrent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it amazes me in hearing particular stories that some of the criminal issues are not what we might think. A particular story locally is the criminal case was dropped, and yet that is the reason for deportation. So it's a challenging situation. Related to that, it says we often hear the phrase merit-based migration. From your experience and from your faith perspective, what are the pros and cons of this concept?
Well, that's the struggle is, I don't believe in merit-based. I believe in immigration for all different types of reasons. And I don't think we should be trying to, the other issue is that, I believe in redemption, that people can change. And so even people that have a criminal conviction, why are we trying to make this into good migrants and bad migrants? Many people have been put in a situation where they were forced to do things that they may not be proud of. And yet, as a person of faith, when are we, why can't we move from merit-based, even family-based, to just a time where I would prefer us trying to say, most people I meet in the immigration system, they don't want to leave home. They want to be with their families and in their country, but they're being pulled and pushed out. So, the merit-based, becomes it becomes good migrants against bad migrants, and I don't like that whole connotation. I think everybody has something to offer. It means, like our hospital here in Green Valley, a bunch of rich Japanese people put money in to invest in the hospital so they could get their green cards. Is that what we're going to become? Is a country? I think the custodian or the farm worker has just as much value as a doctor or a business person. Why are we trying to get into merit? And why are we trying to, as people of faith, everybody has value and contributes, makes our community better. In many ways, I would take some of the day laborers are strong community people. They're the backbone of our community. They just don't get any credit.
Right. All are created in God's image, I think we say,
Yeah.
right? So related to that, Kevin asked, if we were to give you the magic wand and create an ideal immigration system, I know this is a big question, so take any portion of it that you want. What would you recommend? I heard some things that you just mentioned, like that the immigration system is bigger than our country, that it actually has to do with international politics. But what else might you mention?
Well, so just, I think what we have focused on is security. And so we basically have built a cage, and now we're stuck in this cage. And I know Biden has said, we're going to stop building the wall on day one. But what I want to hear is, what parts of the wall are you going to take down? And when are you going to start defunding some of the border patrol so that we don't need a military force along our border? What we need is a good program, a good work program that entices workers to come and work in the United States for a couple years, and then they return and they build up their country. So one of the ideas that we've had for a long time is that when people come into the country, when they come to work, that they post a bond of $2,000 or $3,000. They're paying that to the cartels right now. Almost everybody crossing the border is paying the cartels. Even if they don't use the cartels are charging people to go through the desert. So, charge people $2,000 or $3,000 and put it as a bond. And then every employer that they work for has to put 20% of their wages on top of that bond. It's a savings program. And so then when they return after 2 years or whatever amount of time, if it's a year and a half or 6 months, then they go and they cash out their bond, and that's a savings that they can then go and buy the taxi and be a taxi driver in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, or they can build a business. Or I want communities to thrive in Latin America, and that, I think that's a much better system than, and then it becomes circular again. We want people to come and go, and if they like it, then and they have a family here and their roots become here, how do they really become part of the community is what we want. We don't, so enough.
No, that's really important. And I thank you so much. And I guess Kevin thanks you because that was his question. Kate asks you that in 2009, some seminary students were in Nogales, and she says, we participated in a humanitarian aid desert walk. As we heard about people's lived experience there, including how many lives are lost or stolen, can you tell us more about the policies that persecute people who assist the people who cross over the border?
Yeah. So there have been a number of different times where the federal government has tried to basically come after humanitarian workers. We had it back in maybe 2004, 2005. 2 of our volunteers were arrested. There was a big federal court trial, and they were let, basically the Border Patrol had watched us humanitarian workers doing what we were doing, and then they finally tried to stop it and throw the book at everybody, but they'd watched us do it for 7 years. The federal judge said, the Border Patrol and the humanitarian groups need to get together and work together, and find ways to work together. So we did meet a lot with the Border Patrol for a number of years. Recently, there's been a number of things that have been happening. It's been escalating throughout this administration, but Dr. Scott Warren, a Samaritan from a No More Deaths volunteer out in Ajo, was arrested, went through 2 court cases, and was acquitted and found not guilty both times. The bottom line is that the government has come after humanitarian workers something like 55 times and have not won yet. And so we feel we stand on really good legal ground that humanitarian aid is not a crime. And even though the Arizona federal attorney said, oh, you know, we're going to come after, we're going to continue after, right after the Scott Warren case, he said, you know, we're going to continue to prosecute the humanitarian workers. They have, so then they have, there is the No More Death camp that is very close to us in Arivaca. And just a week ago, they raided that camp again. I don't think the volunteers were arrested. They did detain, this time I think 13 to 16 migrants. The time before it was like 40. So that camp over this summer has been raided, I think, 3 times by the federal government, by these BORTAC units, highly militarized helicopters coming down and dusting everybody, and it's dangerous what they're doing. I still stand that the humanitarian workers have won 55 lawsuits, and the government has not won them.
So I have one last question, which will be our closer, and I think it's not a softball. It's one that we can all gain from your wisdom as we continue to try to talk about this immigration system, especially with people who may not see it the same way. And I think it's Kevin, it could be Liz that says this. It saddens me that humanitarian issues are politicized. How do we best talk and work with those who see immigration and those seeking asylum as a political issue, to see it from a perspective rooted in empathy?
Yeah. Well, I continue to say, you know, we need to become better at talking about our faith. You know, the stories I told about the faith traditions, we need to value that hospitality is so rooted in Scripture that we need to continue to lift that up. It has much more, there's much more about that in Scripture than to the whole personal salvation. So as people of faith, we need to do a better job of talking about that. And then, you know, we need to, you know, our angle is to talk about it from the perspective of these are the people we love and care about, and they are being brutally torn apart and victimized, and so we need to talk to people about how the people we love are being mistreated unjustly.
Yeah, so it goes back to the story, right? The personal story will make it all the time. Well, I thank you, Randy, for taking the time, and to all the attendees who have put in these questions. And I'm going to turn it back to Carla.
Yep.
Thanks, Randy. Keep on keeping on, will you?
I will. Thank you.
We really appreciate it. And we really appreciate you being here and everybody who is here today. And we're going to close with Susan and Jane, who had to escape torture and death in Uganda. And they are going to sing a song about Psalm 23. So God be with you, people. And thank you for being with us today.
Andunganya era ambali
Thank you all for being with us today. We are appreciative of your interest and hope that you will take the information that you learned today home to your congregations. We will see you all soon. And Randy, thank you again for your time.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to be with you all.